Welcome to Asian Times TV. Today we're going to look at world religions. Last time I had this type of discussion was when Peter Heese, the American historian based in Pondicherry, was kind enough to give us an interview by Skype. We talked about his book on Aurobindo, the lives of Sri Aurobindo and the controversy around the book. So today we're going to talk about similar types of ideas. We're going to look at integralism and the merging of East and West in terms of religions, cultures, ideas, practices, and this fusion that's taking place around the world, my guest argues, is a major force in the world that we have to understand and grapple with. And we have an expert with us today who's really an expert in American religion as well as Eastern religion and thought. And he has studied the confluence between these two streams of knowledge and consciousness, if you will. And we're going to dip our toes, if you will, into this mystical river that continues to flow endlessly to the sea, as Sting has put it in his in one of his songs. So we're going to feel the current of this mystical river. We have with us today Jeffery Kripal. He's the J. Newton Rayzor Professor and Chair in the Department of Religious Studies at Rice Universities. He's an old friend of mine. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dinesh.
I appreciate you joining us. Looking forward to this discussion. So this meeting of East and West has been going on for almost a century, since Vivekananda's last visit, or his main visit in Chicago in 1893, or even perhaps earlier than that, if we go back to the Theosophists or to the colonial period, or even earlier to the early explorers from Portugal or from Europe that went to the East. So that's the discussion we're going to focus on. And I know you've written about this extensively in many of your books. So let's start off where I kind of left off the discussion with Peter Heese in his book Lives of Sri Aurobindo, which created quite a controversy. In India, he was almost deported. And I know that you read the book and reviewed it. What did you make of that, kind of tempest in a tea storm?
Well, Peter's sufferings, came really at the end of a long line of other intellectuals looking at Hinduism in the 90s and into the turn of the millennium, who were using various historical methods or psychological methods that are widely used in the study of religion. And in Peter's case, it was something of a mystery, to be honest, why his attracted so much attention. Is his portrait of Sri Aurobindo is so deeply sympathetic and really profound on so many levels. So it was a real mystery to us, although it made some sense in this larger line of, intellectuals who had been blacklisted essentially for saying very sensible things about various figures in Indian history. So it didn't surprise us, but it's still somewhat troubling on any number of levels, obviously.
Right, and because he's lived in India for almost 40 years, he was part of the ashram, he studied the archives at the ashram, and really knew Aurobindo's work from the archives. But I guess there was some kind of, local politics involved in Pondicherry, which alienated him in some way and led to this debacle.
Yeah, I think so. I think with all of these censorship or ban movements, there are always political forces on the ground that are really driving it. In some sense, it's not about the book, whatever the book might be. It's about these local political processes. That was certainly the case in my case as well.
Right. No. So your case is in the early 90s, right, or late 90s?
Kali's Child was published in '95,
right.
And the censorship campaigns really began in January or February of '96, and they extended really a little past the millennium. So in about 2001, 2002. They were beginning to die down at that point.
And do you think it's partly because of the diaspora, the Indian diaspora, that's now kind of located in the West?
Oh, I think it's a lot. I think it's for a lot of complicated reasons. I think partly it's the diaspora, partly it's a misunderstanding of what the study of religion is and what the humanities are uh, in a larger picture. I think a lot of these censorship campaigns are driven by well-meaning folks who simply have no training in the humanities and approach religious texts like a piece of software or a piece of engineering as opposed to a text with, you know, a dozen or 2 dozen different meanings working all at once, which is how humanists think of texts. We don't think of texts with singular meanings. We think of them with multiple meanings working all together.
Now, without going too kind of deeper into the controversy with Kali's child, I think when we spoke about it, you said there were a couple of factors seemed to be, based on the discussions you had with, you know, various folks in the field, that one was clearly a sort of different understanding of history or historicity, that you know, that is interpreted differently in India, and then the other being kind of a notion of masculinity, which is different, perhaps.
Right. I think that, you know, the controversies around Kali's child were really controversies around sexuality, and in particular male sexuality. And the book is really based on close readings of the Bengali text, and then which I then compared to the English translations, and showed in fairly simple ways how the English translations left out much material that was essentially tantric in orientation and that involved sexual symbolism and occasionally sexual emotions or even sexual acts. So and that was very easy to show with the text, but it's very difficult to handle then to show how those sorts of experiences can be spiritual and sexual at the same time, which is of course exactly what the tantric traditions argue, and which is really part of the study of religion as well, particularly in its psychoanalytic streams.
And what's the kind of Indian take on history then that kind of plays into this in a different way?
Well, I'm not really sure. I mean, you know, for historical criticism, certainly in Western scholarship, simply argues that a text needs to be interpreted in its historical context, and that all texts are human artifacts created by human beings for particular reasons at particular points in time. Religious believers tend to approach religious texts anyway as ahistorical, as somehow eternal and authoritative. So I think the clash is probably there between those two understandings of what a text is and how it should be approached.
Yeah, certainly on the Aurobindo side, and you know, he certainly got attacked for, even though he's an ashramite and a follower of Aurobindo's method of yoga, he got attacked for really contextualizing Aurobindo within sort of the larger historical, you know, forces that he was.
Right. Peter was doing nothing that any other responsible historian or scholar would have done, and he was doing it extremely well and with a great deal of care and precision. So by any scholarly or historical standards, Peter's book is ideal. It's an ideal sort of model of what scholarship should be. So you know, again, that's not how the religious believer tends to approach figures like this, but it's how scholarship works and should work.
Right. Now, reading through your work, I see that Aurobindo is more profound in some ways than I thought in his influence on the kind of the American metaphysical movement, or you know, certainly the ideas that you are been working on for a number of years.
You know, I've always been interested in the way cultures meet and don't meet. The confluences where these two streams meet to form a single or multiple rivers. And 19th century sort of colonial India really was a perfect case of that for me, looking at Bengal and Calcutta in the 19th century.
Right.
My later work really looks at another meeting point, which isn't a colonial one per se, but it's a countercultural one. It's looking at the meeting of East and West in California in the 1960s and 70s.
Right, and that's the Esalen book, right?
The dynamics are very different. And
right.
Aurobindo is extremely influential, in particular to the movement that I was studying, the human potential movement.
Okay.
So he was very much a figure, very much an inspiration for this movement. Probably one of the primary inspirations, along with Aldous Huxley and Abe Maslow and Alan Watts.
I see. Okay. But these guys are much later, right? I mean, Huxley is not a contemporary of Aurobindo. He's writing.
Well, no, he is. Huxley is a contemporary of Aurobindo. Huxley's writing novels through the 40s and 50s, really at his height, probably in the 1940s. So technically, he is a contemporary of Aurobindo. But then he, of course, survives him, lives into the early 60s. He dies on November 11th, I believe, 1963 is when he finally passes.
Okay, so there is overlap. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but is there any reference in Aurobindo's writing on Huxley's kind of vision?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I mean, Huxley's very aware of Indian philosophy,
and
very keyed in to Ramakrishna and what he eventually calls the perennial philosophy.
Right.
So he's very much engaged with India and with Asia in general.
And of course, Maslow and Watts, of course, well-known figures in the American counterculture movement, if you will, or the human potential movement. Maslow with his hierarchy of needs, and Watts with his kind of Taoist influences, right, into
right. Well, Huxley gave the movement this notion of the human potential, which essentially pointed to really Indian notions that the self is not the ego, and that we have capacities or abilities that are in a sense innate or implicit in human nature, but need to be drawn out and developed in practices like yoga and meditation and various other sorts of disciplines. So, and it was Maslow who was talking about actualization or actualizing these potentials, and this notion of self-actualization that merged very nicely with these ideas. And then someone like Alan Watts, of course, was making various forms of Buddhism and Taoism not just sensible but exciting to the youth culture in the 1950s and 60s. So all three of these men played a very large role in this translation.
Right, but in your work, you talk about Michael Murphy, though, as a seminal figure in starting this movement, if you will.
Right. Well, there were two founders of the human potential movement, or two founders of Esalen.
Right.
One was Michael Murphy, and the other was Richard Price, or Dick Price.
Right.
Both were Stanford graduates. Both were athletes, and both were intensely interested in Asian ideas. Mike was primarily drawn to Hinduism, particularly Sri Aurobindo. And this notion of evolution as a kind of driving force of the spiritual life.
No, that's a Western idea, right?
To Buddhism, Buddhist meditation.
That's originally a Western idea, right? The idea of bringing sort of a creative evolution into some sort of a religious framework. But then Aurobindo picks it up, and I got this from Heath as well. He argues that partly it may have been because he had studied in England. His father was trained in medicine in Edinburgh. And so Aurobindo also brings this to India and kind of tries to create a fusion of the Western thought with the Indian thought.
Well, that's right. I mean, this fusion of East and West wasn't invented in California. I mean, it was being done in Calcutta in the 19th century, and Aurobindo was doing it in Pondicherry throughout the first half of the 20th century. And he was doing it primarily through this idea of evolution as a spiritual force, which of course wasn't Darwinian, but was in some ways in conversation with Darwinian biology. And it's that notion of evolution driving us forward and producing various supernormal abilities that gets picked up by Mike Murphy and enters the human potential movement.
And Price as well. There's Dick Price as well.
Yeah, Dick wasn't so much interested in this notion of evolution and the supernormal. He was much more interested in healing practices, in Buddhist meditation, and in what became known as somatics, essentially these body practices that resulted in various forms of transformation and healing.
Wow, which would be another show altogether if we were to go deeper into that. But you talk about in the book, when you present the history of Esalen, as that clearly it may have had a countercultural element to it, but it's futuristic. It's not a thing of the past.
Right. I mean, this is really what separates, I think, these new American metaphysical movements from really almost everything that came before. In most in just about all religious traditions, revelation or the full truth is something that happened in the past, and it's our job as believers or members of the tradition to replicate or to remember or to reenact that full truth that lies in the past.
Mm-hmm.
With Aurobindo and later the human potential movement, there's a radical turnaround where now the full truth of the full revelation resides actually in the future, and we're working toward it. The future is going to get better and better, where in a lot of these traditional religious systems, the future is going to get worse and worse. And may get better eventually, but it's a radically different idea of what revelation is and what religious truth is.
So the recent Pew survey on world religions, I think it's a fairly extensive survey of 230 countries, finds that there are about 16%, about 1.1 billion people around the world, who claim no identifiable religion that they associate with, although many believe in God and some higher power. Is this potentially kind of the global demographic that we're talking about?
Well, yeah, and of course those numbers are way higher in a country like the U.S., particularly if you look at the demographic under the age of 30. If you look at Americans under the age of 30, the spiritual but not religious demographic is by far the highest. In some polls, it shoots up to almost over 30%. So it is the defining worldview of certainly the youth culture in the modern West now, particularly in America. I can't speak for Europe. And I think it's definitely part of this whole scene, this whole confluence of cultures that we're talking about.
Yeah, and the survey
because of
finds
course, when cultures meet, thoughtful people within all of those cultures see very clearly that culture is relative and that religions cannot speak for all human beings. And so profound meeting of cultures and peoples inevitably results in these very liberal strands of religious thinking that we now call spiritual but not religious. So of course it results in other religious responses as well, including fundamentalism, which is in some ways a reaction to these cultural confluences as well. So it's a very complex mix of things.
So in your book on Esalen, you talk about the mystical idea of America.
Right.
And how this genealogy of no religion fits into this mystical idea of America. Right.
And what I mean by that is, by separating church and state, you don't then end up with secularism. I mean, you don't end up with anti-religion. That kind of secularism actually ends up producing more religion. But it ends up producing not one religion, but thousands of them. And so by the mystical idea of America, I mean the way America as an ideal is imagined by people like the Transcendentalists in the 19th century, or by the counterculture in the 1960s and 70s, or by some of the spiritual but not religious crowd today. It's essentially
you talk
an
about
ideal
Whitman.
Which all religions can find a home, but none can claim a majority or the full truth.
Right. You talk extensively in quite poetic detail about Whitman.
Right. Walt Whitman really is the prophet here.
Okay.
The phrase spiritual, actually, the way it's used today, probably originates with Walt Whitman.
Okay.
In 1871, by the way. I'll give you a nice date there.
Right.
Before Whitman, as folks like Lee Eric Schmidt have shown us, the spiritual simply meant the not physical. It's really Whitman who begins to use the term spiritual as a kind of way of talking about not being religious in any traditional sense, but having some profound connection to nature and to the divine. So that it really goes back to Whitman.
And of course, he was drawing upon the Eastern traditions as well, though. Whitman was as well in his poetry.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Transcendentalists were really in love with Hinduism and Buddhism and the East in general. Whether they understood it or not, they were picking up basic ideas that speak to a similar kind of sensibility.
Now, in your recent work, you've shifted to looking at sci-fi and comic books. You're looking at like Superman and X-Men, which makes perfect sense to me, but I'm just trying to kind of make the sort of connection for my audience here. And you quote in your book on mutants and mystics, you quote Philip K. Dick. The quote is, "Let the boy mature, but do not let the man hold back the boy."
Right. So there's a funny way of explaining this in a more professional way. The funny way is this is my midlife regression book.
I see.
I've returned to my boyhood.
No, but you make a profound point, though.
The more professional response, though, is this idea that evolution is a spiritual force producing supernormal powers in human beings. I mean, when I finished the Esalen book, I found myself becoming obsessed with the comic books of my boyhood, particularly the X-Men. And I couldn't figure out why at first. I just thought it was an embarrassing regression. But then I realized that idea is essentially the X-Men mythology, and that these mythologies that were created in New York on the East Coast in the 60s bear an uncanny resemblance to the mystical movements that were created in the 60s on the West Coast. And so what Mutants and Mystics is a book about that resonance or that correspondence between the American West and East Coast around these evolutionary mysticisms.
Right, and kind of the American DNA, again, kind of futuristically projecting itself into the unknown.
Right.
Trying to grapple with the unknown, right?
Through science fiction, at least in some of its cases, not all, becomes a kind of code for religious concerns and magical transformation.
Okay, and then I think in your recent book, you're concerned with the paranormal. Again, trying to look at it from the same lens, but kind of trying to tap into what other biologists and others have called kind of the morphogenetic field, that there is this higher intelligence that's out there. It exists. It's always there. And sometimes we tap into it through these experiences that border on the paranormal.
Right. Well, the paranormal is a highly abused word, of course, today. As a scholar of religion, I only work with highly abused words. And the paranormal is one of them. But it actually originates with French scientists at the turn of the 20th century. And what they meant by it was something happening in the physical environment that corresponds perfectly to something happening in the mind of a particular person. So there's this kind of one-to-one correspondence between a physical event and a subjective experience, with the poltergeist being a perfect example. You have a emotionally distraught or sexually conflicted adolescent around whom things are flying and breaking and bursting into flames. So the physical events are acting as signs or signals of a subjective state. And what the authors of the Impossible book does is it shows how these things have been really well theorized in the history of the modern university, but also how they act like texts. When you talk to people who have these experiences, their most common descriptions, they'll say something like, "It was as if I was a character in someone's novel," or "It was as if I were in a movie." And so I think that's kind of the key to these events, is interpreting them as texts.
This is also a film. This is also a film project, right?
Study with microscopes and rulers.
I see. And this is also a film project. I think you said you were developing a film around this theme. Is that
right? We actually, a colleague of mine here in Houston named Scott Jones, we're working on 2 documentaries. One's called Supernature, which is on the Esalen project, the Esalen history, and the other one's called Authors of the Impossible, which is on the Authors of the Impossible book.
Now, in the opening of this book, you talk about this event with the Kennedy, the Robert Kennedy assassination.
Right. Yeah, the book opens with a friend of mine named Adam Crabtree, who a former Benedictine monk and later became a psychotherapist, and he has essentially a precognition and then a deep connection with the Bobby Kennedy assassination, thousands of miles away from where it's happening. And so the book begins with that story, just as one example of countless events like this that happen really every day to people around the globe. And I'm just trying to make a plea in the book that we stop shaming these people and dismissing these events and look at them as opportunities to think anew about what mind is and what human nature is and who we are.
Right, we're trying to open kind of the window to a higher form of cognition beyond kind of the everyday mundane consciousness that we're narrowly focused on.
Right. I mean, essentially what I'm arguing is that we all have superpowers in us that are latent or innate. And these things usually aren't called up until we're in a traumatic or dangerous situation. And then they just happen. And we don't understand how, we don't understand why, but we know that they happen. And the book's really a plea to think about these things more seriously and more generously and with more compassion and less censorship.
And that's kind of where the confluence of East and West as well meets, right? East, which is now becoming more materialistic, and West perhaps becoming more spiritual.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't like to talk about the East and the West anymore, of course, because it's all mixed up, and the East is in the West and the West is in the East. The way I think about it is that my latest work on the paranormal really is a lot like my early work on the erotic and the mystical, where the early work was trying to insist that you really can't separate the sexual and the spiritual. My latest work on the paranormal is that you really can't separate the mental and the material, that the relationship between mind and matter is as mysterious as the relationship between sex and spirit. And to the extent we separate these things into artificial binaries or categories, we're really missing what's actually going on.
Got it.
Which is way more profound and way more flat out interesting than the ways we normally think or talk about it.
Fantastic. Well, on that deep and profound thought, we've run out of our time. So I want to thank Jeff Kripal for joining us for this fascinating talk. Hopefully you'll come back.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me, Dinesh.
I appreciate it. And I want to thank our audiences for tuning in to Asian Times TV. Tune in again next week. Thank you.